Okay, this is the 1-minute warning for starting the streaming. So we will be gaveling in 1 minute. This meeting of the Legislative Audit Commission will come to order. It is April 17th, 2023. Members, we were going to have a subcommittee meeting prior to this, but schedules are a bit challenging right now. So we're trying to reschedule that so we can pick the topics. But this morning we are going to hear a presentation, a program evaluation report. I believe this is the last one from the topics selected last, kind of the last one. Because we've already hit the other topic a couple times, but Rent Help Minnesota. So welcome. And I am going to have to leave about 10:02. So I'll be handing the gavel over to Senator Cran at that moment in time. And I expect there will be members coming and going throughout the session as this is the time we are in. So welcome, Ms. Randall and Ms. Rodriguez, if you could begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Judy Randall. I'm the Legislative Auditor. Pleased to be here today. First, I do just want to thank you all for your flexibility. As Chair Hansen noted, we had some last-minute schedule changes yesterday due to, well, you know, legislative session. So we are working on rescheduling the subcommittee so that they can continue with the topic selection process. And then we will, of course, bring those selections before the full Audit Commission to finalize the topic. So expect or warn your LAs that we will be sending emails related to scheduling. And so thank you again for your flexibility there. As Chair Hansen said, this is kind of our last program evaluation for this round. We do have one more program evaluation coming out related to the Southwest LRT. Of course, we have already done significant work in that area, but we do have one more report coming out yet this session, and that is still in the works. But today we're here to discuss our evaluation on RentHelpMN. We did release this report last week, and so we're happy to have an opportunity to discuss our findings and recommendations here today. And of course, Commissioner Ho is here as well to respond to your questions. So given the time, I'm going to just turn it right over now to Deputy Legislative Auditor, Ms. Rodriguez. Thank you.
Welcome, Ms. Rodriguez. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Jody Munson Rodriguez, and I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor for OLA's Program Evaluation Division. Before I get started, I do want to recognize the team that worked on this evaluation: Laura Schwartz, Gretchen Becker, and Eleanor Berry. So this evaluation was unique for OLA in a few ways. First, because it was a bit of a retrospective. RentHelpMN stopped taking new applications at the beginning of last year and has largely wound down at this point. And second, because RentHelpMN was a large federally funded emergency program meant to address a global pandemic and its effects that we all, of course, hope never happens again. Therefore, we offer recommendations as lessons learned that could potentially be applied to other types of programs that Minnesota Housing may be tasked with managing in the future. So I'll start by sharing some of our key findings from the report. We were tasked with looking primarily at application processing, so looking at eligibility determinations, and also with payment processing, so looking at the extent to which payments were correct. What we found was that RentHelpMN took an average of nearly 3 months to process applications throughout the lifetime of the program. We found that the program was slow to distribute program payments at the beginning of the program, but it did then speed up distribution considerably. We found in a small sample of applications that we looked at that there were some processing errors. And we also found that at the launch of the program lacked a few important components. So I'm going to step back now, provide you a little bit of more information about the program, some more information about our findings, and then some recommendations to consider for future programs. So as an overview, the COVID-19 pandemic created economic instability, not only for renter households, but also for owners of rental properties. And RentHelpMN was intended to help prevent homelessness and maintain housing stability at that time. The US Congress enacted the Emergency Rental Assistance Program in late 2020 during the ongoing pandemic and during a related nationwide moratorium on evictions. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program provided funding not only to states, but also to some local government entities, as well as some tribes and tribally designated housing entities so that they could provide temporary financial assistance to renter households. The assistance could be used for rent or utilities expenses. And Minnesota Housing called the state of Minnesota's program RentHelpMN. This program was completely federally funded. Minnesota Housing received a total of about $598 million for RentHelpMN through two separate congressional appropriation laws. This amount was separate from amounts that were received by certain American Indian tribes and local governments in Minnesota. If you have the full report in front of you, you can take a look at page 9 in Exhibit 1.6. We show that Minnesota Housing did not receive that total in one lump sum. It was received in portions from January 2021 through January 2023. Federal law established basic eligibility requirements for households to qualify for assistance. These requirements included being a renter household and having experienced a financial hardship due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Federal law also allowed states to prioritize among applications for assistance. So as you can see on this slide, Minnesota Housing limited assistance to households with at least some past due rent. As of January 2023, Minnesota Housing had expended or obligated about $500 million of the $598 million the state was allocated. The majority of this, as you can see on this slide, was dedicated to direct assistance payments to renter households. About 58,600 households received assistance through the program. The households we found received on average about $7,300 in assistance, and they received assistance for about 9 months on average. Besides direct payments, Minnesota Housing primarily dedicated funding to its contracts with implementation partners. So Minnesota Housing contracted with a number of organizations to perform activities related to rent help. By far, its largest contract was with Witt O'Brien's, which performed application processing, program management services, and other services for the program. Other partners included field partners. The report's appendix lists Minnesota Housing's field partners, which were used to create awareness among renters and help renters with the application process. Minnesota Housing received more than 107,000 applications for RentHelpMN during the 9 months that the program was open for applications. During that time, Minnesota Housing did not establish standards for how quickly the contractor had to process applications, and applications took, on average, nearly 3 months to process. As the chart on this slide shows, application times improved over time. So while they started out at an average of about 170 days at the beginning of the program, by the last few months of the program, they were averaging about 55 days. I should note that a number of landlords and field partners that we spoke with or heard from expressed dissatisfaction with how long application processing took. Now, as shown on this slide, Minnesota Housing made its first RentHelpMN payment in May of 2021, and over the following 4 months, distributed less than $8 million per week. As you can see in this graph, distribution rose significantly in September 2021 to about $26 million per week. Now, beyond reviewing the speed with which RentHelpMN applications were processed, we also reviewed the accuracy with which they were processed. To do that, we looked at a non-statistical sample of 41 applications We found that 10 of those applications had been denied for being ineligible and 31 were approved and paid. In looking at those 41 applications, we agreed with 40 of the determinations. So we agreed with all 10 denials. We agreed that they did not demonstrate that they were eligible to receive benefits through the program. And we agreed with 30 of the 31 that were approved and paid. However, for one of the applications, we determined that the applicant had not demonstrated in their application that they had past due rent, which, as I noted, was a eligibility requirement for the program. In looking at those 31 applications that were paid, we also determined that in 26 of those applications, the applicant had received the correct amount of rental assistance. As you can see on this slide, we found in 5 cases that we believed the documentation did not support the amount that was paid. And we do provide more details about those cases on page 27 of the report, if you'd like to take a look at that. We also surveyed a sample of landlords. We received responses from about 200. 19% of the landlords we surveyed who told us that they received a payment from RentHelpMN said that they received a payment for the incorrect amount. So either more or less than the program determined that they were eligible to receive. Now, given these findings, I think it's noteworthy that Minnesota Housing staff told us that the agency did not conduct systematic audits of its contractors' application determinations. So this brings us to our first recommendations. We recommend in the future that Minnesota Housing should establish standards for application processing time and measure the contractor's performance against this. We believe that without such standards, the agency has few ways to hold a contractor accountable for providing timely service. In addition, we recommend that Minnesota Housing collects sufficient documentation and that it audit cases. This will help Minnesota Housing determine whether application processors and contractors adhere to standards and make consistent determinations. I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about overpayments. So Minnesota Housing did use a few methods to identify overpayments. For example, staff analyzed program data to identify payments that were made for more than the eligible time frame. There were a specified number of months for which renter households could receive benefits. So they looked at data. They also had established fraud detection and prevention processes through which they were able to identify some overpayments. And as of September 2022, the agency had identified 630 overpayments totaling about $3.5 million. I do want to note that the 630 overpayments do not include all program overpayments. For example, they wouldn't include overpayments that program participants return voluntarily prior to receiving a request from the program. So in November of 2021, Minnesota Housing issued guidance for staff on how they were supposed to recoup overpayments. And in mid-February 2022, the agency really ramped up its efforts to recoup those overpayments. I'll note that on average, Minnesota Housing sent initial recoupment letters, so letters requesting those overpayments back, about 6 months after it made overpayments. And in some cases, the agency did not send a letter for more than a year. Now, as as this table on our slide shows, Minnesota Housing, as of September 2022, had recouped close to $500,000 of the $1.3 million in overpayments that it found were not associated or suspected of fraud. It had recouped a little over $200,000 of the $2.2 million that were suspected of fraud. So these were the numbers we had as of September 2022. So relatedly, we recommend that Minnesota Housing develop comprehensive procedures for recouping overpayments before issuing payments in future programs. We also recommend that it promptly begin recoupment efforts once it identifies an overpayment. We believe that this will help increase the likelihood of recouping those overpayments. And last, I'll just touch on program policies and procedures. I do want to note that as an emergency program, RentHelpMN provided critical assistance to many Minnesotans during the pandemic. And it was necessary for Minnesota Housing to get this program up and running very quickly. And it did so. It was able to launch the program within 4 months. But we believe that there were some components missing at that time of launch. So for example, the policies and procedures manual that application processors were supposed to follow lacked some important details, such as which costs could be covered by the program. I'll note that there were also insufficient customer service mechanisms at that time. So applicants, for example, could not directly contact application processors. They would have to wait to respond to a message from the processors in order to have direct contact with them. In our survey, most landlords that tried to contact the program expressed dissatisfaction with customer service, as we show in a graph on page 37 of our report. And last, we note that the agency did not sufficiently test some aspects of its program software. So for example, some of the program participants reported many difficulties uploading documents to the online portal that they used in most cases. So we also recommend that Minnesota Housing should establish clear, comprehensive program policies and procedures, ensure program participants have sufficient access to knowledgeable program staff, so sufficient customer service mechanisms, and that they conduct more extensive testing of its data systems before launching the program. And that concludes my prepared remarks. We'd be happy to take questions if you have them.
Members, Representative Anderson.
Thanks. I have a couple. First of all, did the payments go to the landlord or the renter?
Ms.
So-
Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Anderson. The payments were required to first be try to go to the landlord. If the landlord refused to take the payment, then the agency could work with the renter to provide it or directly to the renter.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you. I mean, these are just broad numbers, but if about 20% of the, these were incorrect, and I know some were overpayments or underpayments, most seem very small sample, but there were more overpayments, right, than underpayments. 20% of the, I guess my question is, do we think this 3.5 million is actually reflective of the amount of money that was overpaid at all? Do we have any idea?
Ms. Rodriguez.
Mr. Chair and Representative Anderson, I do just want to be careful about those results. As I noted, it's a non-statistical sample. And so while it indicates that we did find some errors, we certainly can't project those numbers to the full population. But in terms of that being indicative of overpayments, I think that it is indicative of the ones that the agency was able to identify using the varied methods that they were using, which I noted they did have a couple of different methods.
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Anderson. And I'm going to check with the staff, but my understanding is that 3.5 million also does not include those that a landlord returned on their own. So no, it's not reflective of the total overpayments. That's that full answer. And then I will just echo what Ms. Rodriguez just said, which is, we looked at 41 cases, right? And so it is not, you can't extrapolate from that, right? It's a non-statistical sample, which is a technique used to test controls, but it is not a representative sample of a large enough sample size to then extrapolate to the full population. So what our testing did was identify that there were problems, but we can't then say, and this is for sure, it's definitely a 20% or a 15%. One final note I will say is while 19% of the landlords who responded to the survey indicated a problem, I think we can assume there's a response bias in that people who did have a problem were more likely to respond to the survey. And so, we did a broad sample of landlords and heard back from 23%. And so again, in that 23%, you can't assume that was perfectly representative because again, I would assume a response bias in that. So all of that is to say there are caveats around this information and the numbers, but we definitely identified problems with controls and payments. Thanks.
Thank you. I have no further.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And how quickly did they cover underpayment? Ms. Randall?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. You switched on me. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Kwan. I'm not sure that we have the timeliness broken out that way, but I'll check back with staff, and if we can separate out how quickly they corrected that problem, we'll get that information to you in the full committee.
Representative Quam, any follow-up? Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing is 3.5 million have been identified. What proportionality is that of all that's been analyzed? So therefore we could guesstimate how much unidentified overpayments. Ms. Randall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Quam. I think that will be a good question to ask the agency as well. Our understanding is that's the entire population that they have identified related to overpayments. But again, it doesn't capture all the people who said, wait a minute, I shouldn't have gotten this check. I'm going to send it back in. And so unfortunately, unless we did a much broader sample, I think it's going to be difficult for us to extrapolate. And I do want to just add, just kind of editorialize for a moment. Part of why we didn't do a bigger sample is it was surprisingly and perhaps concerningly difficult to actually go through each file and determine eligibility. The policies were confusing. They weren't always clear, as Ms. Rodriguez said. I think reasonable people could use the same policy manual and look at the same file and actually come up with different ideas. So we did a lot of cross-checking with the agency. We didn't always agree with the agency's determination, but so again, we felt that our sample was enough to say some things, and we wish we could go further. I think to go as far as you're interested in would be an enormous lift.
Representative Quam? Mr. Chair, on this and all the other related things, it'd be nice to understand the process for reporting if there's a consideration of fraud or suspicion of fraud, that process, and when there's fraud sort of confirmed, is there some type of list that's generated that then is shared with other government entities? Because unfortunately, oftentimes the fraudsters repeatedly do this across multiple programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Conman. We'll have soon we'll have Commissioner Ho up, but we'll get the question done for the legislative auditor. And so, Ms. Munson Rodriguez, do you have additional comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Quam. I will note that on pages 28 and 29 of our report, we do provide some information about the fraud detection and referral systems that Minnesota Housing had in place. And so they were working with the Attorney General's office, with the U.S. Department of Treasury, with the BCA, and with some other kind of local law enforcement entities when they were identifying cases of fraud to make those referrals.
Thank you, Ms. Munson. Ms. Randall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Quam. I just wanted to comment on the sharing across agencies about fraudsters. I think it's a great question, and I think it's honestly an ongoing challenge. I mean, we're seeing that with, frankly, folks who have been named in the Feeding Our Future allegations, and it's work that we are trying to do to try to provide some of that cross-agency information, but there is not a centralized place, and there are limits, of course, on how agencies can share data. So I just wanted to acknowledge that point, and that it's an ongoing issue, I think, across state government on how to share that type of information.
Ms. Randall, and on that point, I know it's complicated. You just described the complexity. What feedback or what communications do you receive across the multiple agencies once a referral is made? Is there, I assume if you're actively involved in requesting information, that seems natural, but from the point of charge, what portion of those that are referred ultimately end up into at least even being charged, more or less convicted?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a great question. Certainly when we're sharing that information with an agency, we are asking for information back. to see if we can identify a serious concern about fraud. And then we would share it with our local law enforcement partners. And then whether or not it's prosecuted then becomes a matter of law enforcement.
Thank you, Ms. Randall. Up next, we have Representative Jacob.
Thank you, Chair Fran. So I think my questions kind of continue on with the fraud issues. And I got a couple of them answered already, but it's, what's really the penalty for those that we've determined have committed fraud? What's the penalty for those that have committed fraud?
Thank you, Mr.
Randall.
Chair and Representative Jacob. And I'll let the agency also talk about the ones that have been prosecuted. I think there's still, most of them that have been identified are still kind of in the works. And so I think it depends on the law enforcement at what level they're making the charges and how serious the fraud or alleged fraud is. Sorry, it's kind of a non-answer. Sorry.
Representative Jacob, follow.
Yeah, so one follow-up. For those that are not suspected of fraud, there's approaching $1 million there. What's a method to hold those, recover those funds for the ones that are not fraud?
Ms. Munson Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Jacob. I believe that the agency can say a bit more about this, but they do have a process through which they request through letters of recoupment, so a payback of the overpayment. And after a certain point, if the individual does not pay it back, they can refer the case to the Attorney General's office.
Thank you, Ms. Munson Rodriguez.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Jacob. Next, I have Representative Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I really appreciate this. And sort of turning to the question of processing speed. And so that we know that, this is and as we think about the purpose of the audit and how it can inform us, understanding that this was an emergency program to deal with a mass eviction crisis potentially and help people stay in their homes. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about when we talk about, and I know we heard a lot in the legislature about frustration with the processing speed, frustration with getting the money out the door and keeping people, keeping renters in their home. Are there, I saw both conversation about the eligibility determination and then the getting the money out the door. Was there delays in both of those? Could you sort of expand on that? And also with an eye to when we think about the future, if there's recommendations on how we could potentially help agencies that are dealing in crisis do that quicker.
Ms. Munson Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Greenman. I'll note that in both of them, I don't remember the page, I think it's on page 20 of the report, but we do talk a little bit about how Minnesota compared to other states. I'll note that we looked at some data from other states and comparatively, we put out first payments a little bit behind some of the other states. So I believe about 2/3 of states had gotten out first payments by the end of April of 2021, and we were looking at mid-May. In addition, in terms of the amount going out, we are a little bit slower to get money out. So I think in June of that year, over half the states had gotten about 4% out. We've gotten about 2% out. So I would say comparatively, we were somewhat slower. I do want to note that as time went on and we got towards the end of that application period, we did overtake most states in terms of our payment processing speeds and the amount of time it was taking to get amounts out. So I think that there were a number of factors that that went into kind of a slow ramp up. Part of it, as we note in the report, was that the first contract with their contractor who was doing the application processing was to have up to 100 processors. And so, I think that they started off with around 80 some, and then they significantly ramped that up within a few months. I think that they renegotiated their contract in October, if I remember correctly. And at one point they were at over 600 processors. So there was some kind of constraints in terms of the amount of money they were allowed to spend on administrative costs. And so once they exhausted that for their first kind of tranche of money, it was exhausted. And then once they got more for the second allocation, they kind of started ramping up that just that human piece of how many people were doing the processing. Is that?
Ms. Randall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Greenman. I did just want to point you to pages 22 and 23, where we walk through a number of the factors that contributed to the longer processing times. I mean, and Ms. Rodriguez touched on a bunch of them in her presentation, the technical difficulties, the staffing issue. It was a manual review of paper and of information. Sometimes the long nature itself then created more delays because now all of a sudden people were eligible for more rent because it had taken so long, but then they had to go back and get more information. So you can see that. And then one of the key recommendations that we have, if we're looking at this as a lessons learned, is to establish some standards up front of what are we expecting, right, for the processing time. And then actually holding the processor accountable to that. And that mechanism wasn't in place. And so there was a little bit of, again, I think there was desire to process it expediently, but in terms of knowing what the expectation was, I don't think that was clear and it wasn't necessarily a shared expectation.
Representative Graham, follow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, thank
All
you.
right. Representative Lee?
Thank you, Chair. Auditor Rodriguez, just so we're clear, then in determining the eligibility, it was the program partners, the processors, and not the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, correct?
I'm sorry. I didn't want to demote you. Ms. Rodriguez?
Mr. Chair
Senator.
and Representative Lee. Yes, they did have contracting partners that did the application process. I will note that Minnesota Housing was then the entity that put out the payment.
Representative Lee, follow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then maybe Auditor Randall, I think you kind of highlighted this response to Representative Greenman. There weren't really any standards to hold them accountable. And so can you tell us what is the general standards, whether that's over at Minnesota Housing Finance Agency or for our agencies in general in state government when they're contracting out with private entities like these program partners today?
Ms. Randall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Lee. It's a great question because this can be applied right across all of state government. We contract all the time with entities to do things, and having a clear contract, right, with clear expectations. Often we have, either a work plan or, some explanation of the work that's going to be performed with measurable goals, with timeline goals. And so it's kind of a contracting 101, right, that we would expect of all of our agencies with all of their contractors. And that's the same situation here. What are we expecting them to do, by when, how do we measure their success? And then I would say the agency also has a responsibility to go in and measure that success. And that's another thing that Ms. Rodriguez pointed out, was that the agency wasn't conducting any independent auditing itself, going in and spot checking, which would have also helped with some quality control.
Thank you, Ms. Randall. Representative Lee?
Sure. Thank you, Chair. Auditor Randall, then, is there any roles or responsibility of the program partners for being accountable to the recouping of the funds, since they were the one that was making the determinations?
Ms. Randall?
Mr. Chair, Representative Lee, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that right now. My expectation is that would be in the contract. And we can look and see if it was in the contract and get back to you, or the agency might have an answer for you today.
Thank you, Ms. Randall. Representative Lee?
Thank you, Chair.
And Representative Lee, so I think your questions are good, and they do apply across the board. And it really goes into most of what we do, and many things we do is subcontracted. We contracted out to the private industry. It's been repeated. That's my 40th year this month in that industry. And what we've worked really hard to do is to try and change and revamp the entire procurement process. Because today we can be taken advantage of as a state without good, clear SLAs, policies, procedures, or a procurement process that allows that vetting to occur before we sign the contract. And typically it happens post-contract, when we have the first effective communication about what did we really ask for. And so we've done that from an IT perspective. We haven't codified it, but we're moving in that direction. And we have to do it regardless of whether it's in the nonprofit world, these services or IT services and all of those things. We're doing that now. And we have to, if you would love to sit down if you want to understand it a little bit more. When we do that, we all win. The contractor wins because it reduces their risk, and then we operate technically at the lowest possible cost. But two, it allows us to then further hold them accountable to the service level agreements that are embedded within the contract to perform at the highest level. Today, that doesn't happen. Almost exclusively, we go out and in this case, we're going to do an emergency contract. Still doesn't mean we can't take a couple days to do a thorough vetting and to implement the things that are most critical in a procurement across the board. We want the monies to go to the people in need, and we want to be able to make sure we can hold every single contractor accountable. And at the end, we do all win. So I'd love to work with you if you're interested. All right, Representative, I'm sorry. There's a promotion to Senator Drazkowski.
Okay. Flashback. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez and Ms. Randall. Ms. Randall, you went, and I don't know if I might have missed it in the discussion here, but you were talking about looking at some of these overpayments and some of the fraud that occurred here and comparing against other programs. Have you found any within Rent Help Minnesota yet that any people who committed fraud in any of the other programs? Is there evidence that, are there one or more people you've identified, I guess, so far?
Ms. Randall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Drazkowski. We have not. We also have not done that work. I was talking more generally about when we look at that and also looking at the folks named in the Feeding Our Future scandal, but we have not done that yet with the folks identified through Minnesota Housing.
Senator Drazkowski?
Thank you, Ms. Randall. I was just reading, 7 landlords said they had received a payment for someone who was not their tenant. So that's 7 out of 154. Ms. Rodriguez, can you elaborate on kind of that area of what you learned and saw? I find that pretty troubling.
Ms. Rodriguez?
Mr. Chair and Senator Drazkowski, yes. As Ms. Randall noted, some of the processes just for determining eligibility for reviewing information, they were quite complex. And one of the things I'll note, we didn't mention it in the presentation, but is in the report, that several of the items, individuals were allowed to attest to the information. And so this was allowed by federal law. And so Minnesota Housing did allow individuals in certain cases. For example, if they didn't have a lease, they could attest to a person being their landlord or being a renter. And so I think that there were a number of things that happened there in terms of it's a complicated process. It was a huge ramp up with processors. There were some issues with policies not being applied consistently or having sufficient clarity. And, you know, in some cases, there was this ability to attest, which again, it was an emergency program. And so the federal government determined that this was appropriate. But I think that there are a number of things there that were just complex that could lead to a determination like that. And I will note, again, this was something that was told to us by the landlords. It's not something that we identified in our work.
Senator Drazkowski, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. So yeah, I'm still trying to, you've got kind of several things here you did. You surveyed landlords and you also did sampling of the applications. And in another place on page 26, in another 6 of the 13 applications, the property owner name listed on the property ownership record did not match the name listed on the IRS document and or lease. Can you similarly comment on that?
Ms. Rodriguez?
I apologize. I have a camera right here, so I'm kind of doing this too. Sorry, Mr. Chair, Senator Drazkowski. So that was another one of the areas where I'll just note that it was a really complex process for us to go through the files and try to kind of trace what was set out in policy and try to follow that path that was set out to make determinations. And so, you know, one of the things that we first looked at was for that property ownership documentation. In some cases, because either the property owner or the landlord, so the property manager, could be the one getting the payment, that might not match. But within the policies, then there were supposed to be notes within the file about how that discrepancy was taken care of. And in some of those cases, we were able to see how they were able to remedy that, either through attestation or other methods. There was one in which we did not see how that discrepancy was remedied.
Senator Skowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. Just an observation, and maybe you can confirm my back of the napkin math, Ms. Rodriguez, but it appears that both the phone surveying, or however you surveyed people, landlords, 19% there, and also with the review of the applications, 6 out of 31, about 20% there as well. They kind of line up pretty close in terms of that rate. Am I comparing apples to apples here? Kind of. Maybe one apple was bitten into or something.
Ms. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Jaskowski. I think it's more of an apples to oranges, because they were two very separate methodologies that we use. One, which again, the files, what we found there, we can't extrapolate within the survey. It was, about a quarter of the random sample that we surveyed responded. And as Ms. Randall noted, there could be some response bias there. So I don't want to kind of put any unfair, weight on the fact that those two percentages are similar.
Senator Skowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. So you actually want to be scientific. Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Barr, and then Senator Barr, you have a quick question. We'll do that, and then what we'd like to do is bring Commissioner Ho up and just give her an opportunity to present, as well as field some questions. So, Senator Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to clarify, did I hear you correctly? And you said there was some payments the landlord did not accept. They said that wasn't our tenant, and then the tenant was actually paid directly. Did I hear that right or not?
Ms. Rodriguez.
Mr. Chair and Senator Barr, no, the tenant was not paid directly in those cases. The landlord was paid. And what they told us, again, this was through our survey. What they told us is that they received an incorrect payment and then returned it.
Thank you.
With that, members, I think what we do, Commissioner Ho, if you could come up. We're going to try and, I think it's busy both in the House and the Senate this morning. So if you could keep your remarks, we'd love if you could do it in 5 minutes, Commissioner Ho, and then we'd like to take a few questions. We would like to get out your members by 10:30. So everybody's got a busy schedule. Welcome. We appreciate you here coming, Commissioner Ho. So if you could, you have a few remarks. The floor is yours.
Chair Curran and members of the committee, my name is Jennifer Ho, and I am the Commissioner of Minnesota Housing. I hope that I got the right angles here. Thank you for the opportunity to respond to the Office of Legislative Auditor's performance evaluation of the RentHelpMN program. And thank you, Auditor Randall, for the time and effort your team put into the review of RentHelpMN. In 2021, nearly a year into the pandemic, renters and property owners were in great distress. There is no safety net for renters who cannot pay their rent, and a statewide system to access emergency rent assistance on an open pipeline has never existed. When Congress enacted an unprecedented stimulus program to help renters and property owners in crisis in the last days of 2020, Minnesota Housing stepped up to build this massive and complex program. All told, RentHelpMN helped more than 58,600 households, providing critical housing assistance at a very stressful time in people's lives. I appreciate that the OLA report highlights the unique challenges of setting up a program in a matter of months to deliver unprecedented aid during a pandemic. As noted in the report, RentHelpMN was a new, large, and complex federal program that required accuracy and speed in the face of changing federal guidance and limited administrative spending. We value the recognition of the unique and challenging circumstances of this emergency program, since this context impacted every aspect of program design and implementation. The report provides a detailed discussion of RentHelpMN's policies and program implementation. The report provides numerous recommendations that are good governance and best practices for program implementation around establishing comprehensive policies, testing, and setting standards for performance. In general, I agree with these recommendations. However, I would note that many of the recommendations are based on operating standards appropriate for an existing mature program or a new program with sufficient time and resources to design, launch, and operate. The standards are much harder to apply in a large, new, complex emergency program with limited administrative budget and extreme urgency. The impact of the pandemic affected every aspect of this program's implementation. This was a new program with still evolving guidance. There was, for instance, no prior basis for processing time standards. We monitored processing time data, adjusted staffing, and worked with the vendor on continuous improvement. Should Minnesota Housing need to create a centralized emergency rental assistance program again in the future, the OLA's recommendations in this regard will be helpful. Minnesota Housing acknowledges the program sometimes caused frustration for some renters and property owners, as the report notes. Yet 90% of the renters who received assistance from the program agreed or strongly agreed that their overall experience was positive. We received comments such as, "I had a great experience, no issues at all. I appreciate it so much. It was a scary time." Regarding our processing of applications and payments, we do not agree with several of the findings. Our detailed review of the cases OLA sampled confirmed that eligible assistance was provided to validated payees. OLA documented our efforts to continue to track and reconcile possible overpayments, the majority of which are suspected of potential fraud. This work continues. Overall, the OLA's review of our processing and payments serves to highlight the incredible complexity Minnesota Housing is tasked with in administering this federal program. Minnesota Housing took extensive efforts to prevent and identify potential fraud, and we appreciate the OLA's acknowledgement of the effectiveness of those efforts. I appreciate the time in front of the Legislative Audit Commission today, and would like to reiterate our appreciation for the time and effort Auditor Randall, Deputy Auditor Rodriguez, and other OLA staff put into this evaluation. I'm extremely proud of the work of the agency and grateful for the tremendous assistance this provided to renters and property owners during a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ho. Members, questions? Senator Skowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Ho. Commissioner, there was, I thought I read 352 individuals that you referred to the Attorney General's office. Can you kind of characterize the communication you've had with the Attorney General's office on those since, and what type of progress can you report?
Commissioner Ho.
Chair Coran and Senator Drazkowski, I'm not allowed to comment on investigations of fraud that are underway. We do have relationships with the Attorney General, with the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, with the Office of Inspector General, the U.S. Department of Treasury, and with some local law enforcement agencies, depending on the case, but I'm not allowed to comment on the details of cases that are under investigation. And I apologize for that, but I think it's.
Senator Skowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Commissioner Ho, I'm not asking for individual cases or individual details. I'm wondering, how is it progressing? Do you have the sense that the Attorney General is pursuing these? Has he communicated back to you as much? Have you had meetings with him? I don't think that's covered in the protected areas that you suggested.
Commissioner Ho.
Chair Coran and Senator Drazkowski. So we have the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. We have a contract with them, and they're handling many of the local investigations. We've referred cases that met the threshold for Treasury out to the Office of Inspector General. And we do have regular meetings with the Attorney General and the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to discuss the status of cases.
Senator Skowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And in general, the cooperative efforts do you have with the investigation before, during, and after would be nice to know in general terms, no specifics. What I'm looking at is how can we improve with enabling language the cooperative efforts to address, to flag more quickly, to prevent, and et cetera with fraud. So that way, if any systematic or procedural information you can pass on, may assist us here and in the general legislative community on how we can better, because every year, few years, we hear about fraud. And a lot of people are saying, why aren't we doing something about it? And you're on the front lines to be able to tell us how we can assist you in doing that. So maybe offline, you can communicate with the committee. Thank you.
Commissioner Ho?
Chair
Any-
Karen and Representative Quam, thank you. I would just point out, on the top of page 28 of the report, the agency did identify over 4,350 potential fraudulent applications that we did not make payment on. So we had actually a pretty effective detection process up front. There were some where after payment had been made, we received a tip that maybe had been fraud. And it's in those cases that we then work with law enforcement. But the vast majority of suspected fraud, we never paid on. And so I feel like that was a good aspect of the program, and appreciate the auditors pointing that out.
Thank you, Commissioner Ho. Representative Quam, any quick follow-up? And then we go off to Representative Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Commissioner Ho. And I guess what I'm interested in, and again, with the spirit of this was both a unique experience, and I think unfortunately the idea of emergency support with sort of a federal and state overlay is something that we're going to probably see, right? Sort of standing up a program. And so when we think about what we can take from this experience, and I heard you say that, shifting and sometimes federal guidance is a challenge as the state is setting programs like this up. I think that we've seen that in other areas of federal state partnership. I'm wondering if you can offer some insight, some sort of lessons learned about, and I'm specifically thinking about the getting sort of money and support out the door to landlords and to folks who need it. But are there things, given the environment and given as we look forward, that maybe we can say in retrospect would be helpful for agencies who are sort of in the same position that Minnesota Housing was in 2021?
Commissioner Ho?
Chair Coran, Representative Greenman, thank you for the question. I think in reflection, the best way to prepare for the next enormous crisis would be to have a continuously operating federal emergency rental assistance program that would allow us to have the process very fine-tuned, the work routinized, basically, so that it would be about putting a large infusion of federal money into an existing and established program, as opposed to having to start from scratch, build something on the fly, only in order to shut it back down again. So I think there are benefits to thinking about the fact that an ongoing federal program that could be scalable during an acute crisis would be beneficial and make it more efficient to do the emergency work when that crisis occurs.
Representative Green, quick follow-up.
Yeah, just quick follow-up. And I really appreciate that, because what I hear you saying is some of the challenge is just in response to a crisis, trying to set up some of these standards and sort of the whole program. It's probably not the time where we're making the sort of best and most strategic decisions. And so if we can use this experience, I think, and where we got to at the end of the program to do some of the things I think Senator Cran was saying, which is make sure that we are really thinking about best practices with result in our contracting and stuff. So I really appreciate that comment. Thank you.
Commissioner Ho? Any
All right.
response?
No comment.
Okay, thank you. We've got Representative Anderson. And then next up, we have Representative Lee.
I'll be brief. I think, we had a lot of fraud in a lot of programs at the federal level, at the state level, and a lot of it was due to, I think things were new, and there were folks that were running things that this wasn't something they had done in the past, and just setting standards. And it wasn't just within here. I mean, I'll be honest, this is probably less fraud here than in many other programs, both at the state and federal level than we've seen. So I'll give you a little kudos for that. So
Taken.
but I think, when we're setting up any kind of emergency contract, it still goes back to contracting 101. There are standards and they don't need to be, they exist. And I would encourage your agency, as all agencies, to, should we ever find ourselves in this, to lay those out as the legislative auditor reported, and do that up front, set those standards up front, make sure the contract is managed correctly. And the other one little minor thing I want to mention is typically when the auditor is making recommendations and has findings, they're right. And I know that you mentioned that you agree with some of them and some of you don't agree, but I would encourage the agency to relook at those that maybe you don't agree with, because they probably are right. And they're things that can help should this ever occur again. I'm not so sure it will ever occur again. And I certainly don't want, because it was a disaster, I think, the whole way everything was done, anyway, that's all another whole issue. But I just want to make those comments, should that happen. So again, that you're ready. Contracting is pretty basic, so that I would encourage you guys to look at that. So thank
Commissioner
you.
Ho, any comments?
Chair Coran and Representative Anderson, thank you. Just to be clear, we did have a contract with the processor, and it did have standards and goals. It did not have one around processing time because we didn't have any empirical data on which to create it. Just one.
Commissioner Ho, I'll follow up on that one. It would be, so with that then, I assume you use the emergency procurement standards or emergency procurement vehicles to enter into the new contracts. Did you do that in a written, did you also then perform a written requirements document? And then before contracting, did you discuss the details of that written requirement, and or was that post-contract?
Sure, I would have to go back and double check the details of the timing on that. I can get back to you on that.
Okay, Commissioner, I know that's not a quick answer, but those are the things I'm most interested in, because it's foundational literally to everything we do. So with that, Representative Lee, you're good? All right. Commissioner Ho, I think Representative talked about, it appears that it's less fraud, and I would hope that it would be, but I think the overall general conversations were, it happened so fast, so furious. There weren't procedures and policies or anything that was consistent from a systemic, one from a documentation or what are the policies and procedures, two systemic systems needs to be able to track and be consistent throughout the vendor community that you did hire. And it sounds like they had difficulty really understanding, because it's such cursory review of the program. We really don't know if it was better or worse than our fraud or any of the other programs that we've always that we focus on a continuous basis. So to me, that's a challenge, and we can talk about the emergency need, and is very quick and those things, but it appears consistent with those things we've been doing for decades. And so that's why I think we get the scrutiny. We want to make sure that every single dollar goes to the right person. I know you do too, but at the end, we need some accountability baked into every single one of these things, whether it be what we deem an emergency or what we deem a daily obligation for whatever the entitlement, whatever the program we have determined a need for. And so for me, those are the things that, if it's an emergency and that poses problems for you, I want to sit down and talk with you, figure out in emergency needs, how do we make sure not to toss away all the core, the key contracting requirements and the vehicle to ensure we end up with a better program than what we did today. So would you like to comment on that, Commissioner Ho? Right.
No, Chair, would be happy to have that conversation.
Excellent. And then I think we'll do one last question. Senator Skowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Ho, you mentioned you turned away, and it's in the documentation, 4,350 applications suspected of fraud. What's the agency's response to those individuals? Did you, as you look at your other agency programs, will there be some sort of, will a flag come up or something when that person comes forward? What did you do in response to those individuals? Did you do anything? Did you talk to them? Did you categorize them? Were there duplicate applications? Did somebody apply 10 times? What did the agency do in response to those, or did you just kind of throw them in the circle file?
Commissioner Ho?
Chair Karen, Senator Drazkowski, when people were denied because of suspected fraud, they did have the opportunity to appeal if they felt that they had been wrongly identified in that regard. We did extract those from the total number of applications in terms of tracking because we felt they weren't legitimate applications. But we didn't throw them away. We don't tend to do retail banking like this program. Minnesota Housing is a housing finance agency. We tend to work on larger scale efforts. And so this doesn't really track with our core everyday work, but certainly what we learned about the potential for fraud in the operation of this program will be things that we bring into the other work that we do. Oftentimes we do it in partnership with community organizations, and we're not the ones that are actually handling it on an individual claim basis. That was the big change for us in this program. But definitely we'll take the lessons learned.
Thank you, Commissioner Ho. Senator Drazkowski, you good?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Ho. I mean, over 4,000 applications. I suspect the auditor has that information as well as she continues to do her work. We've got people who certainly want to cash in on government as soon as they see it coming, and it's pretty evident there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Drazkowski. And I'd like to thank everyone with no further questions. We'd like to thank the legislative auditors and their staff. And thank you, everyone, and Commissioner Ho for being here. And with that, members, we have no further business for the Legislative Audit Commission, and we are adjourned.